Thank you very much, Jorge. First of all, let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this absolutely beautiful building, this beautiful university, and this place seems to be steeped in history. So it's a huge honor and a great privilege to be here. Also, I have to thank the previous speaker because it's a major effort to try to match his presentation, which was extremely clear and very interesting, in fact. So thanks as well, John. Anyway, I'm going to do my best. So as Jorge said, this presentation is on algal blooms in seawater reverse osmosis. First, my co-authors, so the two students that worked on this presentation, Laureen Villacorte and Asieta Batabai, and my co-authors, Sergio Salinius and Emeritus Professor Jan Skippers at UNESCO IT. Now, the presentation is all about algae. And as we know, that algae live in rivers, lakes, but also in seawater. They're unicellular, they're microscopic microorganisms, and they're very small, somewhere between 2 and 2,000 micrometers. They differ from other groups of small microorganisms in that they contain an internal pigment called chlorophyll. And this chlorophyll allows them to combine water and carbon dioxide and produce organic substances. In fact, they produce their own cell walls. So without the light, they cannot reproduce and grow. And part of the material that the algae produce are what we call transparent exopolymer particles, or TEP. And these substances are very sticky, and these are released from the algal cells as they're growing. Finally, we know that the algae, as they bloom, depending on the type of algae, they have many different colors. So they can be green, blue, red, or golden. Now, these are some common species of bloom-forming algae. There are over 1 million species of algae, in fact, and about 400,000 of them we actually know. But here, for instance, I can show you, this is a red tide alga bloom. I'm not sure, my cursor doesn't seem to work. No, I'm not sure if this one. No, okay, so the one on the top left-hand corner is the tamarenza, so it's the Alexandrium. So this one causes a red tide, and you can see the slightly red color. The one beside it is a Noctiluca, and down at the bottom here you have the Phaeocystus and also some of the diatoms. So these are just some of the species we find in seawater. Now, what problems can they cause for desalination plants? Well, they cause actually a lot of problems. So one of the key things that we have to worry about is the formation of what we call a harmful algal bloom. And I generally tend to believe that all algal blooms are harmful for desalination plants. But some are harmful in that they produce toxins. And when they produce toxins, they cause fish kills, and they can also create anaerobic conditions. However, this is generally not a problem for public health because the seawater reverse osmosis membranes have such high salt retention that they retain all the toxins. So actually, we don't have to worry at all about toxins even when we have a harmful algal bloom. But we have to worry at the front of the desalination plant because the algae themselves clog the strainers and they clog the media filters. They also foul the pretreatment system, so the micro and ultrafiltration systems and also the media filters. They can also cause fouling on the reverse osmosis membranes themselves. As well as that, and particularly in thermal plants, they cause taste and odor problems because of the temperatures. So in the Middle East, when there's a severe algal bloom, many of the thermal plants shut down, not because of clogging, but because of the smell. And finally, of course, if there's toxic compounds, well, in the seawater systems, we're able to remove them, but if not, they can also kill fish and even humans. Now, these are just some pictures. And this is a typical picture of the Gulf. Here you can see a satellite image of the algal bloom in 2008-2009. It started out in the Sea of Oman, and it moved all the way up around the Strait of Hormuz into the Arabian Gulf. And the yellow dots are all the seawater desalination plants which were affected during that algal bloom. And of course, many of the plants had to shut, some of them for long periods of time, in fact, because of the impact of the algal bloom. Now, this is just some information from Oman, and here we see the occurrence of harmful algal blooms. So these are algal blooms that produce toxins over the years. And we do see a slight increase in the frequency since about 2008 and in 2009. But in fact, every year in Oman, they have an algal bloom. It's not always a harmful algal bloom, but they have one every spring and every autumn. In fact, in the North Sea, we also have an algal bloom every spring and every autumn. So it's something we have to learn to live with, in fact. So the particular problem with the algal bloom in 2008, 2009 was it lasted for between 6 to 8 months. So normally an algal bloom has a duration, at least the peak of the bloom, has a duration of a number of weeks, maybe 1 to 3 weeks. But in severe cases, of course, this bloom can continue. Now, many of the algal blooms in Oman seem to be caused by a couple of species. So here I have the occurrence of the algal blooms, and these are the different types of algae which they have found during these algal blooms. You see the cochleodinium, which is the second last one. That's a toxic algal bloom, and that one seems to recur quite frequently. Also, the Noctiluca seems to be very prevalent in Oman water. I have tried to grow both of these species in our laboratory, and the Noctiluca is so difficult to grow. But still, it blooms every year in the Gulf of Oman. So there's some peculiar combination of nutrients, light, and temperature which promote the growth of this algae. Now, these are just some pictures from the Gulf of Oman. This is a cochleodinium bloom near Dubai. Now, it's very difficult to find good data in the literature on algal blooms and desalination plants. So what we generally find is that the algal cells themselves, they cause the pretreatment systems, but also the spacers of the RO system to foul. And we need to monitor the concentration of the algae, but also the chlorophyll in order to be able to get background information on the blooms. So here I've compared, for the cochleodinium, I have compared some data from the Gulf of Oman with South Korea, and also for the Noctiluca. However, there's very little comparative data out there. Now, here is a picture of what the world looks like in terms of chlorophyll from remote sensing data. And here you can see the only places really with low background levels of chlorophyll are in the middle of the oceans. You see almost all coastal regions have chlorophyll, in fact. And this scale ends at about 10 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll. But in fact, it's greater than 10. So where you see the red areas or the yellow areas, the scale is not calibrated, in fact. So it could be 11 micrograms per liter, but it could also be 50. So what MODIS only shows up to 10, in fact. Now, when we go back to the bloom which they had in Oman, it was caused by the cochleodinium polycricrides type of algae. Their concentration, at least on the days that they actually measured, reached about 27,000 cells per milliliter. The algal bloom caused, as I said, severe clogging of the granular media filters, and they had to be backwashed really frequently. In fact, they were continuously in backwash mode. Because they were continuously backwashing, there was no water to feed the seawater RO plant. So the seawater RO plant itself did not foul. It was the media filtration which clogged. So as well as the clogging, they also had a very high effluent on the permeate of the media filter. So the SDI was way above 5. And of course, again, this also is a reason to shut down the seawater RO plant. So as the operation is only guaranteed when the SDI is below 5. So at this point, the lesson learned was that a much more robust and reliable pre-treatment is required during an algal bloom. Now, what does fouling look like on a seawater RO during an algal bloom? Well, we're going to start here again. We said that when we look at algal organic matter, which is what the algae actually release, it contains a wide number of compounds. So I mentioned these transparent exopolymer particles, TEPs, which are of great concern, but also the algal organic matter contains proteins, polysaccharides, lipids, other biopolymers. And the abundance of AOM can be measured by actually measuring the transparent exopolymer particles, and also by measuring what we call the biopolymers, just simply using the liquid chromatography method. So we monitor both of these in order to keep track of a bloom. Now, these transparent exopolymer particles, what do they look like? Well, they're gel-like substances. In fact, they're mainly water. And we can only make them visible when we stain them with a dye called Alcian blue. So they're found in all fresh water and seawater. They're mainly made up of acidic polysaccharides, and this can range from phytoplanktons all the way to bacterioplanktons. One of their characteristics is they're extremely sticky, about 10,000 times stickier than any other suspended particles. And here I have a picture of, on the bottom here. Here you can see these are the algal cells, the cells in the middle here, and the gel-like material around them is the TEP when it's stained. If it's not stained, I cannot see it because it's a clear gel. Now, we believe that these transparent exopolymer particles, and they can vary in size up to about 200 microns, we believe that these can directly foul our membrane systems and also indirectly by inducing biofouling. Now, here we have grown in the laboratory 2 different types of algae. So the red-tide dinoflagellate and the Chytocerus affinis, which is a marine diatom. And in this picture, I'm not sure, oops, sorry. In this picture, you can see here the green line. So at the start of the experiment, I have on the y-axis here the algal cell count and the TEP concentration, and on the x-axis the incubation time for the algae, and on the other y-axis I have the MFI-UF, which is a fouling index for that type of algae. And what you can see, the cell concentration increases up until about day 30, and then it decreases as the algae die. But what you can see, the TEP concentration and the fouling potential increase all the time, even after the algae die, in fact. Now, we did this for several types of algae, and we tried to correlate the fouling potential of the algae with some parameter. So on the left, we tried to do that with the cell counts. We tried the cell number, we tried chlorophyll, and we tried the cell volume. But in all cases, there was no really good correlation with the fouling index. Then we tried it only with the TEP concentration, and we found that there's a reasonable correlation for at least certain type of algae with the fouling index. So we came to the conclusion that if we try to correlate the transparent exopolymer particles, we get a better indication of the fouling potential of the algae. Now, this is what transparent exopolymer particles look when they're put under a confocal laser microscope. So the algal cell is the large structure in the middle, and on the left you can see the transparent exopolymer-like material, which is a gel-like material, and it contains a lot of sugar. So you can see there's a lot of fructose in there as well. Now, here you can see it again. So this is the algal cells again, surrounded by sugar. Here it's for the Chytocerus. Now, when we look also at what the algae release, so this is an LCOCD chromatogram. So at the bottom here, you can see it. So at the bottom here, I have the medium which I use to culture the algae. So this is the Alexandrium, this is the Chytocerus here. So this is at day 0. Then we inoculate the algal cells, and they start to grow, and we harvest, and we watch what's happening. So you see there's an appearance here of biopolymers, here, and this continues as the algae grow. So what the algae are actually doing to a large extent, they're also producing some low molecular weight substances, but they're releasing a lot of these large biopolymers. Now, how might this impact the reverse osmosis system? Well, in the reverse osmosis system, the left-hand side is the feed, the right-hand side is the concentrate. So because of the stickiness of this algal material, it tends to adhere to the membrane surface. And in time, of course, the water contains bacteria. Even though our pretreatment might be ultrafiltration, it can give us a 4-log reduction, maybe 5 even, so 99.999% of all bacteria are removed. But even if one bacterium gets through, if it can colonize the reverse osmosis membrane, I have eliminated all the competition, because now that couple of bacteria which have survived have all the food, and they can continue to grow, in fact. So because the feed water contains nutrients, there's always carbon there, even small amounts, there's always nitrogen, and there's always phosphorus. So what happens is I slowly get a colonization of my membrane. And the belief is that the TEP-like material, or the sticky material that the algae release, are actually causing the sticky layer to deposit, and they're kick-starting this biofouling. So as the nutrients come in, what we see is the layer will actually grow. Now, we tried to do some of these experiments with a membrane fouling simulator. So here we have the membrane fouling simulator. We have a tank where we produce the algal or organic matter, and we recirculate it over the membrane fouling simulator. We did about 4 of these in parallel, and this experiment here on the left-hand side, we have the feed channel pressure drop of the experiment, and here the number of days, and here the relative increase in the pressure drop. So we took 4 of these MFS systems, and we first did on 2 of them a fouling phase with algal organic matter. So we recirculated the algal organic matter over the MFS, and some of it, of course, adhered to the MFS. At some point then we inoculated bacteria into the system, And of course, once the bacteria come in, we also have to add nutrients because there's nutrients in seawater. What you see is the two MFS systems which had no TEP, there's a small increase in the pressure because then there's no sticky layer already there for the bacteria to adhere to. But once you have the sticky layer there, you see that the pressure drop increases exponentially. So we came to the conclusion when we looked at the two systems, when you have the TEP, we also measured the ATP per square centimeter, and it was much higher on the membranes which were coated with TEP compared with the ones without. Now, so what we concluded at this point is that bloom-forming algae are capable of releasing sticky organic substances, which are mainly transparent exopolymer particles. The fouling potential of this algal organic matter, and we describe this in terms of the modified fouling index, it coincides with the TEP concentration rather than the algal concentration themselves. And we also think that the algal organic matter, if it passes the pretreatment system, can accelerate biofouling on the seawater RO. And in fact, effective removal of the algal organic matter is needed on the pretreatment stage. So when John mentioned that he could increase the flux of an RO membrane by a factor 4, I get very nervous because when the pressure increase on a reverse osmosis due to fouling is proportional to the power of the flux. So if we increase the flux at all, the fouling rate also goes up automatically. So if we want to have higher flux reverse osmosis systems, we don't need to do, well, we obviously have to improve the reverse osmosis, but our pretreatment systems need to be much, much better, in fact. Otherwise, we're accelerating the fouling on the seawater reverse osmosis systems. Now, I'm going to skip this one. So we're also going to look now at ultrafiltration as a pretreatment during an algal bloom. And here I have just taken some data from the literature, and I show you the ability of 3 different types of pretreatment to remove biopolymers. So the first one are granular media filters, very conventional, then microfiltration and ultrafiltration. Now the first thing you notice is the variation is huge, in fact, and you see the underneath or the lower values in ultrafiltration approach the maximum values in the granular media filters. Well, for a granular media filter to remove any algal organic matter, it really needs coagulant. So depending on the coagulant dose and how you operate the system, you can also achieve quite good biopolymer removal. The ultrafiltration should give you more, but it also depends on how you operate it, what type of membrane you have, and also whether you use coagulant or not. Now here we look at how micro and ultrafiltration can retain algal or organic matter. So here we have a feed water. This is the LCOCD signal here. And the feed water here, it's a seawater, it contains algal organic matter. So when we pass it through a microfiltration membrane, we remove really the larger algal organic matter. When we pass it through the ultrafiltration membrane, we remove even much more. And when we pass it through what we call a low molecular weight ultrafiltration membrane, which is like a 10 kilodalton membrane, we remove almost all the algal organic matter. And we've tested this for 3 different types of algae. So the retentions of the microfiltration are between 40 and 50%, the conventional ultrafiltration up around 70 to 80, and the low molecular weight up around even over 90%, in fact. Now, here I also compare an ultrafiltration with a granular media filter during an algal bloom. And here I'm comparing it on different aspects. So the one that's most obvious is the flux. The flux on the ultrafiltration is quite low, actually 50 to 100 liters per square meter per hour. On a granular media filter, the flux is much higher, 5,000 up to 10,000 liters per square meter per hour, which means the volume of the actual volume filtered in the cycle here per square meter is much lower than here. But what you see is the lower fouling rate of the UF because it operates at 100 times lower filtration rate than the GMF. So in a media filter, your ultrafiltration will clog much slower than the media filter. However, the residence time in the media filter is higher. There's hardly any residence time in an ultrafiltration, so that there can be no biological removal of any of the algal or organic matter, any of the nutrients in the water. Depending on how you operate the granular media filter, you have residence time. You can put in coagulant and you can increase the residence time in the filter and have a biological layer on the filter, which can help to remove some of the nutrients in the water. So the system will clog faster, but it does have a certain potential for biological removal. Now, how does ultrafiltration foul during an algal bloom? Well, it's pretty similar. So here the yellow line is the boxes here is the ultrafiltration membrane. These are the pores. This is the fouling layer of particles created during the algal bloom, including algae themselves. And as the water is filtered through, when there's no transparent exopolymer particles in the system, the water has an easy route. Because the algal organic matter is gel-like, it will fill the gaps between any of the particles in the water, creating a higher resistance, so that when you backwash as well, you might not be able to remove all the material. And that's because of the stickiness of the algal organic matter. However, usually the chemical enhanced backwash is effective with the AOM because it just simply oxidizes it. Now, here we look at ultrafiltration fouling, and here we have different concentrations of transparent exopolymer particles. And what you see here is the higher the concentration, so this is the lowest concentration going up, the higher the concentration of TEP fed to the membrane, the higher the fouling rate. So this is here the fouling index as a function of the TEP concentration, and you can see it's almost linear with the TEP concentration. So increasing the TEP in the feed water also increases the non-backwashable fouling on the ultrafiltration. Here we try to compare the transparent exopolymers we produced in the lab from our own grown algae with those in real seawater during an algal bloom. And surprisingly enough, we got more or less the same fouling rates on the ultrafiltration in the lab-based system compared with the real seawater. Now, one of the things we've also looked at is how to deal with this non-backwashable fouling during an algal bloom, and one of the obvious choices for an ultrafiltration system is to use inline coagulation. So on the left-hand side here, I have the resistance over an ultrafiltration membrane as a function of the filtration cycle. One line has no pretreatment, which means no inline coagulation, and the other one has about 3 milligrams of iron per liter in inline coagulation mode. What you see when you just have the algal organic matter, the non-backwashable fouling or the resistance due to fouling is increasing in every cycle. When you have the iron in inline mode, the backwashability is quite good, where the resistance is actually quite constant, at least if it's done properly. When you look at it again, so here I'm using 3 milligrams of iron, which is rather high, so we try to do it with a lower dose. So we have done it here again with no iron, and this is with 0.5 milligram of iron, which is approximately what's normally used in seawater systems. So the iron coating in this particular case on the membrane improves the backwashability of the ultrafiltration. Now, we also tried this in a small seawater reverse osmosis plant. It's about 360 cubic meters per day. It's in the southwest of the Netherlands in the province of Zeeland. It's an open intake system with a strainer, and it was actually done in inline coagulation mode with an ultrafiltration system and a 2-pass reverse osmosis system. So here we have monitored the transparent exopolymer particles in this North Sea water in Jacobahaven for 4 years approximately. Here you see we have the chlorophyll concentration, the TEP concentration, and the water temperature. The first thing you notice is the temperature is cycling all the time, warm in the summer, cold in the winter, all the time. We see the chlorophyll A concentration. You see it peaks every spring, just before the temperature, just as the temperature starts to increase, we get a peak of chlorophyll, which is roughly at the same time as the TEP. So the TEP is also increasing as the algae grow, in fact. Now, the plant was an ultrafiltration system provided by Pentair. It's their standard system for seawater with a molecular weight cutoff of 150 kilodaltons. The RO in this system was a Dow. It was a 2-pass Dow seawater reverse osmosis system. Here I'm showing you some results from this plant. So this is the permeability of the ultrafiltration as a function of the runtime of the system. The purple line here is during the algal bloom. So outside of the algal bloom, the plant ran very smoothly. Once the algal bloom started, the permeability dropped despite backwashing. And in fact, we needed to do a chemical enhanced backwashing each day in order to keep the unit clean. When we have no algal bloom, the need for a chemical enhanced backwashing is once every couple of weeks, in fact. So you can see there was a drop in permeability, but then it stabilizes. So then we put the inline coagulation on during the algal bloom, And you can see the inline coagulation was also able to stabilize the operation even during the algal bloom. And the dose used here was about 0.5 milligram per liter of iron. So our algal biopolymers that were produced during the algal bloom can accelerate biofouling on the seawater reverse osmosis systems. Complete removal of algal organic matter is needed if we want to minimize fouling of the seawater RO systems. And ultrafiltration can remove between 50 and 70%, and the low molecular weight cutoff ultrafiltration can remove even up to 95%. So I'd like to thank all those that helped with this research. It was sponsored by WETSES. We were hosted by the Evidis water supply company in Rotterdam, who ran the seawater reverse osmosis system. And finally, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maria. We have a few minutes for 2 questions. Please, Guillermo.
Hi, hello, this is Guillermo from Acciona. Thanks for the presentation, very interesting. It's clear from your presentation that the concentration of TEP becomes a critical component of the fouling in the UF surface. So are there any effective online measurements for TEPs that can be used on an industrial operational site?
No. It's a very difficult method. I believe Acciona have one of their staff, Teresa Della Torre. She also has done quite some research on TEPs. It's a very laborious method, really, and difficult to get reproducible results. It's actually semi-quantitative, I would say. I should also maybe tell you at this stage that you can also measure biopolymers, so that's another surrogate parameter, but measuring TEPs continuously is very difficult. I mean, and if the algal bloom is very severe, the concentrations change very quickly. But it is a good idea maybe to get a baseline for what is it like when you don't have a bloom, and then how high can it be in a bloom. So it is good to get at least some actual data, but there's no online device, no. I know Kurita in Japan were working on one at one stage, but I think they gave up. I never saw the device appear on the market, so I'm not very hopeful that they actually managed to produce it. So.
Last question. Pedro.
I think I don't need the microphone. Thank you. Gracias. Hello. Okay, thank you for your presentation, very interesting. How would you evaluate or value the fact of having flotation systems prior to ultrafiltration for the elimination of TEPs?
A very interesting question. Unfortunately, I have no data on a DAF system, so that's also why I don't include it. So I'm waiting for my first data to be able to evaluate the TEP removal in the DAF. I should say, I mean, the DAF is very effective at removing the algae. That's what it's actually for. But removing the algae is only part of the problem. You also have to remove the algal organic matter. And the DAF will not do a lot for the algal organic matter unless you add coagulant. So you need to coagulate the algal organic matter and then remove it in the DAF. So the same as in coagulation. So if you have a regular coagulation system, you can also coagulate out the algal or organic matter. Then you can sediment it or you can float it, in fact. So. And maybe I should also say that the focus of this presentation is mainly on algal blooms, but there are other sources of biofouling in desalination plants. So algal blooms are only one. I mean, chlorination is a big headache as well. Also chemicals, all the chemicals you use, the coagulants, the acids, the sodium metasulfide, everything you use along the system. And most of the plants are not using food-grade chemicals, because if you were, you'd have maybe very little contaminants. But whenever you have a contaminated chemical which contains nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, that can also promote problems in your downstream reverse osmosis system. So the algal blooms are also part of the problem, but there are several sources of biofouling in a seawater reverse osmosis system.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria, for the interesting presentation.